What if the devil doesn't come with horns and a tail, but with a warm smile, a promise of salvation, and a gentle hand on your shoulder? Jim Jones wasn't born a monster. He was a man who understood people's deepest fears and used them to build a kingdom of control, a kingdom that ended in mass murder-suicide in the jungles of Guyana. But this isn't just a story about cults or madness. It's about the ancient archetypes buried inside all of us. The shadow we deny, the persona we wear, and the trickster who walks among us. In Jungian psychology, the trickster is more than a mischievous figure. He is chaos incarnate, a force that upends order, mocks truth, and dances between reality and illusion. He wears masks. He speaks in riddles, and sometimes he hides behind the robes of a prophet. Jim Jones was no ordinary man. But he didn't begin as a tyrant. He began as a preacher, a self-taught healer, a charismatic leader who offered hope to the forgotten, the poor, the lonely, the broken. He preached equality when segregation still bled through America's streets. He built a community where love seemed unconditional and justice felt real. At least at first. But beneath his benevolent facade lay something far darker, something Jung would recognize instantly. A man consumed by his own unacknowledged shadow. For Jung, the shadow is not simply evil. It is the repressed part of the psyche, the sum of everything we refuse to admit about ourselves. When left unintegrated, it festers, and those who never face their darkness often become its most willing hosts. Jones did not confront his shadow. He embraced it, but only in secret. He projected it outward, onto a world he claimed was corrupt beyond redemption. To him, society was the enemy. Government, religion, tradition, all were tainted, except for him. Only he had the vision. Only he could lead humanity into a new dawn. This is classic trickster behavior. He undermines authority, only to take its place. He destroys meaning, then offers a new one, twisted, absolute, and totalizing. Jones didn't just reject the system, he became its replacement god. His followers didn't see a manipulator, they saw a savior, because they too were running from their shadows. They longed for certainty in a world that gave none. And Jones offered them structure, purpose, belonging. Everything their fractured lives had lacked. Jung called this phenomenon projection, the act of placing inner contents onto the outside world. We don't see people as they are. We see what we need them to be. And so, Jones became the father, the prophet, the protector, until he became the executioner. But this wasn't an accident of history. It was a manifestation of the collective unconscious, a space where ancient patterns repeat themselves across time. The trickster has always been there, in myths, in folklore, in revolutions, and in men like Jones, because the human soul is not simple, it is dual. Light and dark, creation and destruction. And when someone rises claiming to have conquered both, beware, because what comes next may look like paradise, but feel like a prison. What happens when a man begins to believe he is above morality? Not because he's evil, but because he believes he sees more clearly than anyone else? Jim Jones didn't just play the role of prophet, he became it. So deeply that he lost all sense of where the performance ended and reality began. To Jung, this is the danger of an inflated persona. The mask we wear becomes so convincing that we forget we are wearing it. Jones started as a preacher with genuine empathy for the poor and disenfranchised, but over time, his persona grew larger than life, until it swallowed him whole. He was no longer a man among people. He was the voice of justice, the savior of the oppressed. And if he was divine in purpose, then ordinary rules no longer applied. This inflation isn't random. It follows a pattern embedded deep within the collective unconscious, a pattern seen in kings, prophets, and dictators throughout history. When someone begins to embody an archetypal figure, especially one as powerful as the savior or the martyr, they risk becoming possessed by it. They stop acting. They become the role. Jones believed he was building paradise, but in doing so, he created a world governed by fear, obedience, and absolute loyalty. Dissent wasn't allowed. Questioning was betrayal. Even love had to be proven through submission. Because in his mind, only he could see the full picture. Only he knew what had to be done. Jung would say that Jones had not undergone individuation, the process of integrating the conscious and unconscious parts of the psyche. Instead, he was ruled by them. His persona was godlike, but his shadow ran unchecked beneath the surface, and when the shadow is denied instead of confronted, it grows monstrous. That's why Jones could preach compassion while secretly torturing children, why he could cry over injustice while planning mass suicide. He had split himself into extremes, the benevolent leader and the vengeful god, and, in the end, the two merged into something terrifyingly whole. His followers didn't see the contradiction, because they weren't looking for contradictions. They were looking for meaning, for belonging, for salvation. And Jones gave it to them, wrapped in ritual, symbolism, and apocalyptic prophecy. He didn't just run a church. He orchestrated a myth, a living, breathing drama in which every follower played a sacred role. Victims, warriors, martyrs, each believing they were part of something greater than themselves. This is the power of archetypes. They don't just shape stories, they shape minds, they shape destinies. As the years passed, Jones became more paranoid, more controlling, more isolated. Reality bent around him. Truth became whatever he said it was, and those who questioned him were labeled traitors, spies, enemies of the cause. In Jungian terms, Jones was projecting his own internal conflict outward, accusing others of the very things he feared in himself. He saw betrayal everywhere. Because he lived in constant fear of being exposed. He accused others of disloyalty because he felt his own grip slipping, and he demanded ultimate sacrifice because he needed proof that he still held absolute power. In the final days before Jonestown, Jones spoke often of revolutionary suicide, not just death, but death as a statement, a final act of defiance against a corrupt world. He framed it as noble, heroic, sacred. But Jung would recognize it for what it truly was, a descent into the abyss, a surrender to the shadow, a tragic failure to integrate the self, and yet, even now, decades later, the story of Jim Jones continues to haunt us, not because he was a monster, but because he was human, because he understood the deepest needs of the soul and used them to manipulate, control, and destroy. In the next chapter, we will go even deeper into the heart of Jonestown itself. We'll examine how the collective psyche can collapse under the weight of a single, overwhelming idea, and we'll ask the question no one wants to face. Could it happen again? The jungle was silent, but inside Jonestown the air pulsed with fear. It was November 1978. A congressional delegation had arrived from Washington. Reporters, investigators, questions that hadn't been asked before. And suddenly, the illusion began to crack. Jim Jones knew what was coming. Not just legal consequences, but exposure. Revelations about beatings, forced confessions, and psychological manipulation were surfacing. The persona he had built so carefully, the prophet, the healer, the revolutionary, was unraveling. And beneath it all, the shadow surged forward like a flood breaking through a dam. What followed wasn't spontaneous. It was orchestrated. Jones gathered his followers in the pavilion, his voice trembling with rage and despair. He told them they had no future outside Jonestown, that the world would hunt them down, that death was better than slavery, better than betrayal. And then came the most chilling moment of all. He offered them a choice: to die together, to make a statement, to become martyrs, not victims. They didn't scream. They didn't run. One by one, they sat down. Children first, then mothers, then fathers. A line of humanity feeding into a river of poison. Jung once wrote that when people lose connection to their individual selves, they fall into the grip of the collective unconscious, a shared psychic field where ancient patterns repeat themselves without conscious awareness. In Jonestown, that force took over completely. Individual will dissolved into symbolic obedience. Fear became faith. Death became meaning. This was not madness. It was myth made flesh, a ritual sacrifice performed on the altar of ideology, and at its center stood the trickster, smiling, crying, commanding, condemning. All at once, Jung saw the trickster as both destroyer and revealer. He tears down illusions, but often replaces them with worse ones. He exposes the hypocrisy of institutions, only to build his own false temples. He speaks truth, but wrapped in deception. He brings freedom, only to enslave in new ways. Jim Jones was the ultimate expression of this paradox. He broke the chains of religious dogma, only to forge new ones of blind obedience. He exposed the failures of society, only to create a microcosm of even greater tyranny. He promised liberation and delivered extinction. But why did they follow him, even to the end? Because deep within the human soul lies a hunger, not just for survival, but for significance, for belonging, for purpose. And when someone offers you a role in a grand cosmic drama, it becomes nearly impossible to turn away. Jones gave his followers more than a community. He gave them identity. He gave them an enemy, the corrupt system, the evil government, the lying press. And above all, he gave them a mission: to prove their loyalty through ultimate sacrifice. In Jungian terms, they were living out a mythic narrative, unconsciously enacted. They weren't making rational decisions. They were fulfilling a story written in the depths of the collective psyche. This is the power of archetypes. They don't ask for your approval. They demand your participation. And once the pattern begins, it is nearly impossible to break, like a dream that pulls you deeper with every step, until waking becomes unthinkable. Jonestown was not simply a failure of leadership. It was a collapse of individuation. An entire community surrendered their personal journey toward wholeness and instead merged into a single possessed entity. The result was not enlightenment, it was possession. Jung warned that when the unconscious is not integrated, it erupts into consciousness in distorted forms. That's what happened in Jonestown, the unprocessed trauma of generations. The pain of racism, poverty, alienation found release not through healing, but through destruction. And Jones, the self-proclaimed Messiah, became the high priest of that release. Not because he was evil, but because he had never faced his own darkness. He had spent his life projecting his shadow onto others, until finally there was no one left to reflect it back. Only himself. And in that mirror, he saw nothing but emptiness. So he chose oblivion, not just for himself, but for hundreds of others who had come to see him as the only truth they had left. And yet, even now, we look at Jonestown and say, how could they not see? How could they drink the poison? But the real question is not about them. It's about us, about the stories we believe, the leaders we follow, the systems we trust, and the shadows we refuse to acknowledge within ourselves, because the trickster is not gone. He has only changed masks, and he walks among us still. What do we see when we look into the abyss of Jonestown? Do we see only madness, a single man's descent into tyranny, or do we see something deeper, something ancient? repeating itself beneath the surface of history. Carl Jung believed that myths are not just stories of the past. They are living patterns within the psyche, archetypes that shape our behavior, often without us realizing it. And the trickster is one of the most dangerous of them all, not because he is always evil, but because he is unpredictable. He destroys meaning. He creates chaos, and then, from the ruins, he builds something new, sometimes wiser, sometimes far worse. Jim Jones was not born a monster. He was shaped by forces far older than himself, by the hunger for salvation, by the fear of insignificance, by the need to be seen, not as a man, but as a god. And his followers? They were not simply brainwashed, they were searching for purpose, for love, for truth, and they found it, or thought they did, in him. Jung called this process projection. We don't see people as they are. We see what we need them to be, and when someone offers you a vision of the world that makes sense, even if it's built on lies, it becomes nearly impossible to walk away. Jones understood this better than most. He gave people structure in a world that felt chaotic. He gave them identity in a society that made them feel invisible. And above all, he gave them certainty in a time of deep uncertainty. That is the power of the trickster, to offer clarity through distortion, to reveal truth through deception, to liberate through control. But there is another side to the trickster, one that Jung never stopped exploring, because buried beneath the destruction, the mockery, the lies, there is also wisdom. The trickster exposes the cracks in our systems. He shows us where we are pretending, where we have become blind, where we have built false gods and called them sacred. In that sense, Jim Jones was not just a destroyer. He was a mirror, a grotesque, horrifying reflection of the very things we refuse to face, in ourselves, in our institutions, in our leaders. And perhaps that is why Jonestown still haunts us. Not because it was an isolated event, but because it was a warning. It showed us how easily belief can turn to blindness, how quickly faith can become obedience, how fast the desire for salvation can lead to surrender. Today, we like to think we are immune, that cults are relics of the past, that we would never fall for such manipulation, but the trickster has changed his mask. He doesn't wear robes anymore. He speaks in headlines. He hides in algorithms. He lives in movements that promise redemption at the cost of dissent. And the danger remains the same. When we stop questioning, when we stop seeing, when we give too much of ourselves to a cause, a leader, an idea, without ever asking what it truly demands of us. Jung believed that true individuation, the full integration of the self, requires facing both light and darkness, not rejecting one for the other, not pretending the shadow doesn't exist, but bringing it into awareness, understanding it, transforming it. Jim Jones never did that. Instead, he became his shadow, and in doing so, he created a nightmare that still echoes today. So let Jonestown be more than a tragedy. Let it be a lesson about the power of myth, about the fragility of the mind, about the trickster who walks among us, whispering promises, offering salvation, and waiting for the moment when we forget to question. Because the real danger isn't that another Jonestown will happen exactly as before. The real danger is that it will happen differently, more subtly, more convincingly, and maybe, just maybe, we won't even realize it until it's too late. If you've made it this far, thank you. If this video stirred something in you, a question, a doubt, a realization, please share it, hit subscribe, leave a comment, tell me what you saw in the mirror, because the greatest trick the trickster ever pulled was convincing us he wasn't real.